There's a revolution happening in America, and it's not in Silicon Valley or on Wall Street. It's happening in 400 square feet of raw, unfiltered freedom. While your parents are still asking when you're buying that 3-bedroom colonial with a white picket fence, an entire generation is saying, no thanks. And what they're choosing instead, it's going to completely shatter everything you thought you knew about the American dream. Picture this. Sarah is 32 years old. She has a decent job, some savings, and by all traditional measures, she should be house hunting right now. Her real estate agent keeps sending her listings for $300,000 homes in the suburbs. 2-car garages, granite countertops, the whole package. But Sarah isn't interested. Instead, she's planning something that makes her parents think she's lost her mind. She's building a 400 square foot barndominium on a small plot of land she bought for cash. And here's the thing that keeps her up at night, but in the best way possible. She'll own it outright in less than 2 years. This isn't just Sarah's story. This is the story of thousands of millennials who are quietly opting out of a system that promised them prosperity but delivered debt, anxiety, and a lifetime of mortgage payments. And what they're discovering in these compact metal structures is something far more valuable than square footage. They're finding something that's been missing from American life for decades. Let's talk about what nobody wants to admit. The traditional path is broken. Completely, utterly broken. You know the one I'm talking about. Graduate college with debt. Get a job. Save for a down payment while paying rent that increases every year. Finally scrape together enough for a 20% down payment, or more realistically, 3.5%. Sign a 30-year mortgage. Spend the next 3 decades paying mostly interest while maintaining a property that always needs something fixed, replaced, or updated. Work until you're 65, maybe 70 now, and hope you timed it all right. That was the dream they sold us. But somewhere between the 2008 housing crisis and the pandemic, millennials looked at that path and started doing the math. Really doing the math. A $300,000 home with a 20% down payment means $60,000 saved, which for most people takes years, sometimes a decade. Then you're looking at roughly $1,800 a month for the mortgage alone, not counting property taxes, insurance, HOA fees, maintenance, utilities. You're easily over $2,500 a month, every month, for 30 years. That's not freedom. That's a very expensive prison with a 2-car garage. And then someone whispered about barndominiums. These metal structures that farmers have been using for decades, but reimagined. Compact, efficient, and here's the radical part, affordable. A 400 square foot barndominium can be built for anywhere between $30,000 to $80,000, depending on finishes and location. Some millennials are doing it for even less, getting creative, doing work themselves, sourcing materials strategically. But here's where it gets interesting. This isn't about being cheap. This is about being free. There's this moment that keeps happening in living rooms across America. A millennial couple sits down with a spreadsheet, and they start mapping out their lives. On one side, the traditional home, 30 years of payments, maintenance costs, property taxes that only go up, the need to stay employed no matter what, because missing a mortgage payment isn't an option. The inability to take risks, start that business, travel for 6 months, or take a lower-paying job that actually fulfills them. On the other side, a tiny barndominium, paid off in 2, maybe 3 years. Utility bills that are a fraction of a traditional home because there's simply less space to heat and cool. Maintenance that's minimal because metal structures are incredibly durable. And most importantly, freedom. The freedom to work less, risk more, live differently. The choice becomes obvious. Not easy, but obvious. This generation watched their parents lose homes in 2008. They watched people work 40 years for companies that laid them off without a second thought. They graduated into recessions and gig economies. They were told to follow the rules, and the rules failed them spectacularly. So they're writing new ones. The barndominium isn't just a house. It's a statement. It's saying that your worth isn't measured in square footage. That bigger isn't always better. that debt isn't a necessary part of adult life, that the metric of success can be redefined. And when you really sit with that, it's revolutionary. Because for the first time in generations, young people are choosing intentional poverty over indentured servitude. Except it's not poverty. It's minimalism. It's sustainability. It's financial intelligence wrapped in corrugated metal. But let's get real about what this actually means on a human level. Because the numbers tell one story, but the emotional reality tells another. There's this weight that comes with traditional homeownership that nobody talks about. It's subtle at first. You buy the house, you're excited. This is your piece of the American dream. But then the roof needs replacing. That's $15,000. The HVAC system dies in the middle of summer. Another $8,000. The foundation has a crack. The water heater, the appliances, the endless parade of things that break and need fixing. And you can't just ignore it because it's your investment, your equity, your retirement plan. Every repair becomes a financial crisis or at least a source of stress. Every job opportunity in another city becomes complicated because you can't just leave. You're anchored, and that anchor gets heavier every year. Now imagine waking up in your 400 square foot barndominium. You own it completely. The mortgage company doesn't have a claim on it. The bank can't take it. It's yours. And because it's small and well-designed, maintenance is manageable. A problem isn't a catastrophe. It's just a problem that gets solved. But more than that, imagine the mental space that opens up when you're not obsessed with earning enough to cover your housing costs. Millennials in barndominiums talk about this constantly. They describe it as being able to breathe for the first time in their adult lives. They can take jobs they're passionate about instead of jobs that just pay the bills. They can save money not for emergencies, but for experiences. They can think about starting businesses, creating art, volunteering, living. This is what's really being chosen. Not a smaller house, a bigger life. Let's talk about what actually happens when you compress your life into 400 square feet. Because the assumption is that you're sacrificing, that you're missing out, that life becomes constrained. But the people living this way describe the exact opposite. When you only have 400 square feet, every single item in your space has to justify its existence. That sounds restrictive until you realize how much stuff you own that adds nothing to your life. The decorations that collect dust. The kitchen gadgets you never use. The clothes you haven't worn in years. All of it falls away, and what remains is what actually matters. There's this clarity that emerges. Your space becomes curated, intentional, meaningful. You're not surrounded by the chaos of accumulation. You're surrounded by the things you genuinely love and use. And that shift, that move from quantity to quality, changes how you think about everything. Millennials report spending less time cleaning, organizing, and maintaining. They spend less money on stuff because there's literally nowhere to put it. They become more creative with multifunctional furniture and storage solutions. They learn to live seasonally, rotating items in and out. They discover that they don't actually need that much. And the metal structure itself becomes part of the aesthetic. Exposed beams, industrial finishes, high ceilings that make the space feel larger than it is, large windows that bring the outside in. These aren't cramped boxes. They're thoughtfully designed homes that reject the idea that you need 3 bathrooms and a formal dining room to live well. The utility costs are almost laughable compared to traditional homes. Some barndominium dwellers report electric bills under $50 a month. Water usage drops dramatically. Heating and cooling costs are minimal. When you add it all up, people are living on a fraction of what traditional homeowners spend, and they're not sacrificing comfort. They're sacrificing waste. But we need to acknowledge what this really is. This is a rebellion. A quiet, calculated rebellion against everything the previous generations insisted was necessary for a good life. Boomers and Gen X built their identities around homeownership. The bigger the house, the more successful you were. The nicer the neighborhood, the better parent you were. Square footage became a proxy for achievement, for having made it, for deserving respect. Millennials looked at that equation and broke it. They said, what if success isn't measured in square feet? What if having made it means having time, freedom, and peace of mind instead of a mortgage? This drives some people absolutely crazy. There's this visceral reaction from older generations when they hear about millennials choosing tiny barndominiums. They see it as giving up, as failing to launch, as settling for less. But that interpretation misses the point entirely. This isn't settling. This is optimizing for a different outcome. The previous generations optimized for stability and status. This generation is optimizing for flexibility and experience. They'd rather own a small space outright than rent a large space from the bank for 3 decades. They'd rather have financial freedom in their 30s than equity in their 60s. And there's something deeply threatening about that to the traditional mindset. Because if millennials are right, if this path actually leads to happier, more fulfilled lives, then what does that say about the choices everyone else made? What does it say about the decades spent in jobs they hated to pay for houses they couldn't afford? The barndominium movement isn't just about housing. It's about rejecting the fundamental premise that debt and constant striving are normal parts of adult life. It's about saying that maybe, just maybe, there's a better way. But let's not romanticize this too much, because there's a darker undercurrent here that we need to talk about. Yes, some millennials are choosing this lifestyle. But for many others, it's not really a choice. It's the only option left. When the median home price has increased by over 400% since the 1960s while wages have barely kept pace with inflation, when student loan debt has crippled an entire generation's ability to save, when the cost of healthcare and childcare makes traditional homeownership nearly impossible, the barndominium isn't just an alternative lifestyle. For some, it's a lifeboat. There's a fine line between minimalism and forced scarcity, between choosing to live small and having no other option but to live small. And while the narrative of freedom and intentionality is real for many, we can't ignore that this trend is also a symptom of a much larger economic failure. The system that made homeownership accessible to the middle class has collapsed. The safety nets have frayed. The promises made to millennials, work hard, go to college, and you'll prosper, were lies. And now they're improvising, finding creative solutions to problems that shouldn't exist in the wealthiest country in human history. So yes, barndominiums represent freedom, but they also represent failure. Not the failure of the individuals choosing them, but the failure of an economic system that has made traditional housing unaffordable for millions of people who do everything right. Here's what nobody saw coming. The millennials who jumped into barndominiums 5 years ago, the ones who were told they were making a mistake, who were pitted for living in sheds, they're winning. And they're winning big. While their peers have been struggling with rising rents and saving for down payments that keep getting more expensive, barndominium owners have been living rent-free, mortgage-free, building savings at a rate that's almost unheard of. Some of them are now buying land, building second structures, creating rental income. Others are traveling the world for months at a time because their cost of living is so low they can work remotely or take breaks between jobs. The real estate market crashes? Doesn't affect them. They own their space outright. Recession hits? They can survive on part-time work